Thanks very much and welcome. I'd like to add my words of welcome to all of you. Thank you for sharing the late afternoon on a beautiful Friday afternoon in Richmond, Virginia. It's my pleasure to welcome William Galston back to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies. William A. Galston holds the Ezra K. Zilkha Chair in the Brookings Institution's Governance Studies program, where he's also a senior fellow. A former policy advisor to President Clinton, Bill Galston is an expert on domestic policy, on political campaigns, and elections. So his remarks should be appropriate for this season. His current research focuses on designing a new social contract and the implications of political polarization. He's also a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, and before January 2006, he was the Saul Stern Professor and Acting Dean at the School of Public Policy there. He also directed the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy. He's a founding director of the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, and executive director of the National Commission on Civic Renewal, which was co-chaired by William Bennett and Sam Nunn. Galston is the author of 8 books and more than 100 articles in the fields of political theory, public policy, and American politics. His most recent books are Liberal Pluralism, The Practice of Liberal Pluralism, and Public Matters. Those are 3 different books, of course. He's won the American Political Science Association's Hubert H. Humphrey Award. He was a fellow with the American Academy on Arts and Sciences in 2004. He's appeared, of course, on the principal television networks, and he's a frequent commentator on, and I'm sure you've all heard him doing this on NPR. He writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal as well. Please welcome William A. Galston back to the Jepson School of Leadership Studies.
Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I say with more than the usual fervor that I'm glad to be here. I say that because this is the first time I've ever tried to drive down I-95 on a Friday afternoon. The computer told me that it was a 1 hour and 59-minute journey. I toyed with the idea of allowing 3 hours. I rejected that, thank God, and allowed an extra half hour. If I'd made the former decision, I would not be standing before you right now. Well, what I want to do today is to begin with some very obvious phenomena on the immediate political scene, and then to drill down and try to figure out why we are where we are and what we might conceivably do about it. I was tempted to begin with a brief political history of the past half century, but I've decided just to plunge straight into my subject. We're in an election year, of course, and elections are about more than counting votes. Elections reveal peoples to themselves. They're democracy's mirror. And what we see in that mirror is often disconcerting, rarely more than this year. Because in this election cycle, for the first time in many decades, an angry and disaffected working class has found its voice. And many do not like what they're hearing in that voice. Xenophobia, nationalism, and bigotry are among its dominant tones. It's tempting for others to turn away in dismay. But we should resist this temptation, in my view, because underlying the harsh words are real problems that extend well beyond our shores. Indeed, I'd say, widening our angle of vision, throughout the West, democratic governments are struggling to maintain a post-war order premised on prosperity and economic security. Since the onset of the Great Recession, established center-right and center-left parties have failed to meet this test, opening the door simultaneously in many countries to the far left and the populist right. From Hungary to France to Poland, long regarded as the poster child for post-communist democratization, illiberal populism is on the rise. Western democracies may be on different decks, but we're all in the same boat. In a world of mobile capital and global labor markets, we have not yet figured out how to maintain jobs and incomes for workers of modest education and skills. In Europe, the result of this problem has been sustained double-digit unemployment, upwards of 50% among young adults, generating a generation of young adults on the economic margins with little hope of escaping it. The United States has made a different choice. Large numbers of low-wage jobs that don't offer the promise of upward mobility. Since the beginning of the 21st century, in fact, the economy has ceased to work for households at or below the middle. A recent report from the Pew Research Center, close to the gold standard in my book, finds that the median income for middle-class households stands about where it did in 1997. For middle-class households, it hasn't just been a wasted or lost decade, it's been a lost 2 decades. For lower-income households, the picture is even darker. As you know, working-class wages have been on a downward slide for decades now. When we look at wealth, the picture is even darker. Since the early 1980s, adjusted for inflation, the median net worth of upper-income families has more than doubled. For middle-income families, by contrast, the story has been stagnation, and lower-income families are less wealthy than they were 3 decades ago. And unfortunately, the projections for the next decade or two are not much brighter than that. Economic anxiety, demographic resentment, and fears for physical security make a toxic combination. No one candidate in this race created these sentiments, but they're there, and we all have to think them through, and both political parties have to think them through. The Republican Party attracted working-class voters largely on the basis of cultural issues and also a foreign policy that was more to their liking. There was never a close relationship between the economic priorities of the working class and the economic priorities of the dominant faction of the Republican Party. And that tension has now exploded into outright opposition in this election year. For the Democrats, there is also a sobering message. The Democratic Party has become largely an alliance of professional elites with some minority voters, a fair number of minority voters, as a matter of fact. But the message to the Democratic Party is that cultural liberalism and identity politics are not enough, right? There is an economic challenge in the middle of the economic spectrum, a challenge facing people who are neither rich nor poor, but who are working as hard as they can, sometimes 2, 3, or even 4 jobs, just to stay where they are. So, in my book, the election of 2016 so far has been a very useful wake-up call for the United States, for both political parties, for economists, for policy experts, and for all citizens who care about the future of their country. So let me turn to the future of our country and embed it in the past. And what I really want to talk about is the restoration of the American dream, which a lot of Americans are afraid is slipping away from them. And to understand the American dream, we really have to focus on the promise of prosperity that lies at its heart. The American dream, after all, is a promise that, in the familiar phrase, if you work hard and play by the rules, you'll do a little bit better over time. Maybe not every year, but if you look at each 5 years or 10 years, and certainly 15 or 20, you can see progress. And not only that, you have good reason to hope that your children are going to do significantly better than you did. So, progress along multiple dimensions, but starting with the economy is at the heart of the American dream, and I'd like to explain why. In modern circumstances in which all advanced industrialized nations have long found themselves, and in which increasing number of developing and emerging nations now find themselves, economic growth is more than a material objective. It's a moral enterprise as well. And a wonderful economist by the name of Benjamin Friedman, in a terrific book, has explained just why that's the case. Friedman says that the value of a rising standard of living lies not just in the concrete improvements it brings to how individuals live, but also in how it shapes the political, social, and ultimately the moral character of a people. A rising standard of living for the majority of the citizens, he writes, more often than not fosters greater opportunity, tolerance of diversity, social mobility, commitment to fairness, and dedication to democracy. But the opposite is also the case. When living standards stagnate or decline, most societies make little or no progress towards any of these goals. And in all too many instances, they plainly regress. Broad prosperity is both the oil that lubricates the machinery of government and the glue that binds our society together. Economic stagnation means, as we can see, gridlocked zero-sum politics, as well as a turn away from the spirit of generosity that only a people confident of its future can sustain. That's why, in my judgment, the central question the United States now faces is whether the next generation will again achieve broadly shared prosperity, or rather experience continued stagnation or even erosion of its standard of living. I could go on to give you an extended analysis of why this imperative is so imperative, but it seems to me that I've said enough for everyone to get the point. So let me raise the stakes just a little bit farther. And here I'm looking across the pond to Europe, but Sinclair Lewis wrote a once famous, now neglected book called It Can't Happen Here. He wrote it in the 1930s, and you can guess what he was talking about. And the point of this book was that it can happen here, that we are a blessed nation, but we're not entirely immune from the infirmities that beset every political order. We're not. The eternal Roman Empire turned out to be mortal. The 1,000-year Reich lasted for 12 years. We've had a pretty good run, but nations that take stable political arrangements for granted usually live to rue the day. And let me just spend a few minutes unpacking those three sentences. The centrality of economic well-being in our politics reflects long-held assumptions about the purposes of our politics. If economic growth and well-being are in jeopardy, then the consequence is more than unhappiness and social conflict. Our political arrangements themselves are weakened and ultimately could be undermined. As a not quite defrocked political theorist, I can tell you that since Aristotle, we've known that a stable constitutional democracy rests on a large, self-confident middle class in an economic order that is not divided by extremes of wealth and poverty. For Aristotle, these conditions were a matter of chance and good fortune, but in our times they become objectives of economic and social policy. What I'm going to call the liberal democratic bargain has defined the era since the end of World War II. And here's what the bargain is. I'm tempted to say was, but I'm going to keep the present tense. It goes like this. Working with skilled elite bureaucracies, popularly elected governments will deliver economic growth with steady reductions in poverty, rising standards of living for all, expanding physical and economic security, and, not the least, health care that increases longevity and diminishes human misery. For some, I would say the rare few, liberal democracy as we understand it may be an intrinsic good and end in itself, but for the majority, however, liberal democracy is a means to peaceful, commodious, ever-progressing lives. It is, in short, a tree known by its fruits. If it ceases to produce the expected crop over an extended period of time, all bets are off. For a substantial period after World War II, the bargain held, and public support for liberal democracy and its leaders remained high. More recently, the bargain has been called into question, and public support and confidence have waned. I could go through an extended tour of Europe illustrating the significance of the increasing pressure on the institutions of liberal democracy. I suspect those of you who read national newspapers will not need that tour because you know what I'm talking about. Greece, Spain, Poland, Hungary especially. We are talking not necessarily about the end of majority rule, but we are talking about jeopardy to the minorities whom liberal democracy protects. We are talking about authoritarian democracy. It's not confined to Venezuela. And we are talking about circumstances in which the kinds of tolerance of religious and ethnic difference that are at the heart of modern liberal democracies is very much at risk. So, what can we do? I think it's essential for people in my position to be constructive whenever possible. I actually have an elaborate answer to that question, but in the interests of time, let me just give you a sketch. Here's the story we used to tell ourselves. The United States might have more inequality than Europe, but we also had higher social mobility. So you could start at the bottom, and if you worked hard and had some talent and a little bit of luck, you would rise very substantially in the economic and social order. Now, that story may once have been true, but I can tell you for sure that it's not true anymore. To be sure, half of it is true. Our inequality is a lot higher than it is in Europe, but the other half is not. Social mobility in the United States has stagnated for decades, and in all, according to the standard measures, it is now lower than it is in a number of European countries. The income share of the top 1%, this is not a political statement, just Census Bureau numbers, and Bureau of Labor Statistics, the income share of the top 1% has gone from 8% to 20% in the past 3 decades, 8 to 20. And on the social mobility side, it hasn't been a great time for white Americans, but it has been even worse for minorities, especially African Americans. Based on current trends, suppose you divide American households into 5 equal tiers based on income. If you're an African American infant born today, the odds are about 50% if you're born in the bottom that you're going to stay there as an adult. 50%. The odds are less than 30% that you're going to get even to the middle class, let alone higher. So for 70% at this point, the peak of aspiration is to move from poverty into the working class. That's not the kind of promise that constitutes, the promise of American life, to quote a famous progressive. We can have a long debate as to how we got here, but the real debate is how we move forward from where we are. And here are 3 things that I think we ought to focus on over the next decade. And I'm saying this to an audience whose political preferences and proclivities I do not know. And I mean this not as a partisan agenda, but as a public agenda. Things that Americans of goodwill across partisan and ideological lines might want to consider. The 3 things that I think we ought to focus on are, first of all, the full employment of as large a workforce as we can mobilize. Second, economic growth that truly includes all of the people who are willing to work and better themselves. I'm not saying we should neglect those who can't, but at the very least, when the economy grows, people who help it grow ought to get a piece of the action. And third, if there's a moral premise at the heart of the American dream, it's the promise of equal opportunity, not equal results, but the idea that every infant should have a fair chance to succeed based on his or her character and talents, not determined by where you start, but where you have the gumption to get yourself. Okay? Not complicated. But I don't think I'd get a lot of argument with the proposition that we're pretty far from the promise of equal opportunity right now. No sense throwing stones, casting blame. The question is, again, what can we do from where we are? Well, what does full employment mean? Let me begin with a challenge. And it's a challenge to all of us. And many of the people in this room are part of the problem, not the solution. And I include myself in that premise. Namely, our population is getting older. It's getting older at a very rapid rate. 10,000 people are entering the Social Security system every day. Every day. Okay? And the share of the elderly, retired population as a share of the total population is going to skyrocket in the next 15 years. This is going to be one of the most dramatic demographic transitions in the history of the United States. That has all sorts of consequences for the federal budget, but let me not go there. The real consequence is that the growth of our workforce is slowing down. In the next 10 years, the workforce will grow only 1/3 as rapidly as it did in the 10 years between 1995 and 2005. 1/3. What that means is that the growth of people like us is going to dramatically exceed the growth of new young people entering the workforce. You do the math. Right? It's a problem. So what are we going to do about it? We need full employment of the largest workforce we can mobilize. Well, here are some things that we might think about. As you probably know, we've incarcerated a lot of people over the past 2 decades. I'm not going to pass judgment on that. That's a lively political debate if you've been following it. But what we incontestably have not done is prepare them for re-entry into civilian life. As a matter of fact, we've made it almost impossible for them to do so. Because unless when labor markets are unbelievably tight, employers who are entitled to get access to people's records in the criminal justice system will simply not hire ex-felons. And so we're releasing people from prison, we're telling them to go out and make an honest living, and then making it impossible for them to do so. This lacks, a certain essence of social justice and common sense, it seems to me, but it's also self-defeating. We need the largest workforce we can get to support people like me with gray hair. Okay? So why are we deliberately shrinking it? Right? We can be sensible while giving, and protecting employers, while allowing these people to demonstrate that they are willing to re-enter civilian life and live by the law. If we don't do that, not only are we depriving ourselves of their labor and the fruits of that labor and the tax revenues and the Social Security contributions, but we're also setting ourselves up for an endless cycle of very expensive incarceration. It probably has not escaped your notice that many states are releasing people before their sentences are done, not because they've changed their minds about punitive justice, but because they simply can't afford to keep them anymore. I think it would be great to take them off the liability side of the balance sheet and put them on the asset side of the balance sheet. Once again, not complicated. Here's something much bigger than that. We like to think that we're a country where huge numbers of women are in the paid workforce. And it used to be that we were among the world's leaders. Indeed, as recently as the late 1990s, that's where we were. Since then, the participation rate of women in our workforce has declined from 74% to 69%. It's now lower than Canada, Germany, France. We like to think of Japan as this unbelievably patriarchal society where women are supposed to stay home and salute their men. More women as a share of the total are in the Japanese workforce than are in the American workforce. This is nuts, particularly since we know what to do about it. We know that a lot of women who are working part-time would like to work more than that. We know that a lot of women who have left the labor force altogether would like to get back into it. This isn't comfortable. It isn't complicated. It's not cheap either. If we have the basics like paid parental leave and affordable child care and flexible enough workplace schedules so that parents, women as well as men, can plan around those schedules and be able to count on them, I guarantee you that the participation of women in our labor force will rise to European or even, dare we hope, Japanese levels. Let me move to the second of the three objectives that I identified, which I called inclusive growth. That means a growing economy where the fruits of that growth are enjoyed by the people who contribute to it. Once again, a simple proposition. We are now facing an era of much slower growth than we've been accustomed to since the end of the Second World War. We used to take 3% annual growth of the economy for granted. The new baseline is about 2%. Part of that reflects the decline in the growth of the labor force that I've already talked about, but part of it reflects the fact that the rate at which each worker produces is rising much less slowly than it used to. The economists call that productivity. We're in a productivity slump. I guarantee you, if you have a slowly growing labor force and output per worker that isn't growing very fast, you're not going to have a lot of economic growth. You're not going to have a lot of wage gains to share with anybody. So we have to get out of this cycle. Part of it has to do with expanding the workforce, but part of it has to do with making each and every worker more productive. What do you do? Well, there are three things that economists identify. You need to do everything you can to enhance the skills of your workforce. We can, if you're interested in going further into that, we can in the Q&A period. We have to do everything we can to increase the amount of investment that companies make per worker in their outfit, and we have to accelerate the pace of innovation. And there are lots of reasons why corporations have slowed the pace of investment in their plant and equipment per worker. One of them, I would say, is that corporate executives say perfectly reasonably, well, we're not sure if we can produce more efficiently, that there's going to be a market for it. Okay. But most of what is sold in the United States, despite the rise of globalization, most of what is produced in the United States, despite the rise of globalization, is purchased in the United States. If purchasing power is growing too slowly, then you're not going to have steady increase in demand. That is a fancy way of saying that in an era where profits as a share of the economy are at a record high and wages as a share of the economy are at a record low, maybe we need to rebalance a little bit. If profits were a little lower and wages were a little higher as a share of the economy, it might turn out that everybody would be better off, because there would be, over time, more demand for what American businesses can produce in the way of goods and services, and you'd have a virtuous circle. Right now you have a vicious circle where low demand leads to low investment, leads to slowly growing productivity, leads to more of those three, and so it goes. We have to bust out of that cycle as best we can. And at the same time, we need a lot more innovation. That means, among other things, substantial increases in public investment for basic research and development, an area that has been very sadly neglected. And we also need to focus on a sector of the economy that is disproportionately responsible for innovation in the 21st century, namely small business and startups. And some colleagues of mine at Brookings did path-breaking research a few years ago that indicated that for the first time since these measurements began, the number of small businesses going out of business each year exceeded the number of new small businesses. In other words, the small business sector numerically is shrinking. And we're not going to get the innovation we need if that continues. And let me explain why. In the old days, large corporations did an enormous amount of basic research in-house. There are probably some people in this room who can remember Bell Labs. Places like that, which were not exceptional in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But the ability and willingness of corporations to maintain those sorts of research operations has been declining to the point where they have outsourced basic research to two other areas: the federal government, which has been cutting back under fiscal pressure, and business startups. The new business model for big corporations is they'll let the startups do the research and make the innovations, and then they'll buy the startups. Right? That's how it works now. And if you open up the pages of the Wall Street Journal, which is a regular contributor I'm now morally required to read, you open it up, every day you'll see examples of this new innovation strategy where the big outsource it to the small. And if the small aren't able to do as much of it as they used to, well, I don't even have to finish the sentence. You see where it's going. Right? We're going to be trying to grow on the basis of a shrinking innovation base. That's a bad bet, in my judgment. We can talk in the Q&A period, if you're interested, about what we might be able to do to cure that problem, or at least to attack it. The adjective in the phrase inclusive growth is just as significant politically, morally, economically as the noun. What do we want to do? What can we do if we want to include more Americans in the fruits of what growth we have? Well, we can have a long debate here about the minimum wage. I'm happy to have that debate with you. I'm for it within reason. But I think a few other things are less controversial. There's something called the Earned Income Tax Credit that we've used to boost the total compensation of people in low and moderate wage jobs. There's much more we can do with that. And many conservative economists are now coming to the conclusion that maybe we ought to go all the way and have something called a universal basic income. There's a robust debate breaking out about what we need to do as a public matter to supplement the compensation that the market is producing, particularly at the bottom and near the bottom. If we have high profits, and we do, why not expand profit-sharing ventures? If there are corporations that do very well because they've managed to maintain high productivity, why not productivity sharing? I mean, there are all sorts of ways of doing this. There's a lot I want to say about equal opportunity. I think we know some of what we should do there, but as yet we're not completely willing to do it. For young adults, we obviously need to reduce to an absolute minimum high school dropouts. If you drop out of high school in the 21st century, you're dead economically. It's almost impossible to take the first step. I have long believed that we made a wrong turn 20 years ago when we expelled skills education from our high schools. Right? I'm not talking about the return of the old vocational education system where we made lanyards and birdhouses. I still have the birdhouse I made in 4th grade. Not bad for a 4th grader anyway. But no, we're talking about 21st century skills training. And there are lots and lots of our young people who don't want to wait until community college, which they may not be able to afford anyway, in order to get out of deadly dull academic classes and do something with their hands and with their minds engaged in the world. And there's a lot of evidence to this effect. At the other end, we really need to think about early childhood education. We know a lot more than we did 20 years ago about what happens or fails to happen, not just between the year 0 and the year 5, between the year 0 and the year 3, or the day of birth and the first 6 months. There is a maxim that goes back to classical antiquity. As the twig is bent, so the tree is inclined. We are neglecting our twigs, ladies and gentlemen, and then lamenting the trees. And we also have to face up to the fact, if we're interested in full inclusion, that despite the fact that we've made an enormous amount of progress tearing down barriers that existed when I was a boy, they're not gone entirely. Our system of hiring is not completely neutral with regard to gender, race, ethnicity. Our system of compensation is not entirely neutral with respect to those factors. We're cheating a huge share of the workforce, and I think in the long run we're cheating ourselves, because the promise of America is the promise of equal opportunity, and if we're not living up to that promise, we're all falling short. I had an elaborate rhetorical conclusion, reviewing 4 hot-button issues that I failed to address in this talk. I think in the interest of getting straight to your questions, I will suppress that, but let me just repeat the main points. We are not an entirely materialistic nation, thank God, but material progress is an essential ingredient of what we've called now for nearly a century the American dream. The promise of progress that includes everybody has not been kept in recent decades, and unless we pull up our socks and change course, it will not be kept in the decades to come. This will undermine social cohesion and exacerbate political conflict, but it also threatens confidence in our democratic institutions, which rest to an extent that we had better not experiment with too recklessly on broadly shared prosperity for the reasons that the economist Benjamin Friedman pointed out in that long quote. And if we want to return to the material and economic basis of the American dream, we have to focus on a job for every willing worker and the removal of the barriers to employment. We have to focus on accelerating the rate of growth in ways that include all those who contribute to that growth, and we must do more to redeem the promise of equal opportunity. So that's my message for today. Less than a sermon, but more than a lecture. And I'm now happy to subside and take your questions, which will be easier for me to take if I substitute my distance glasses for my reading glasses. I see a hand in the back of the room.
Thank you. I never heard of the concept of a virtuous circle versus vicious. I mean, I guess my thinking always goes to the negative when I make an observation about the direction of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
But why? Do they teach that in school, that concept of, how rich do you really need to be, and couldn't you make space for other people, and the better we all do, the better we all do? Is that kind of an alien concept, or is that generally understood in business school?
Look, my son went to business school, and he tried to explain to me what he was studying. I don't think he succeeded, although it made him very good at his work. He's a venture capitalist. But he certainly believes in virtuous circles, because he thinks that if he takes capital and invests it in new ideas, that the people he invests in will be better off. He will be better off, but when the good ideas succeed, then lots of other people will be better off as well, and so it goes. And the better off we are, the more slack we have, and we can think about saving. We can think about being able to pay for more of our kids' education rather than forcing them to take out student loans that create such a burden after they graduate, if they graduate. So I think when you think about it for a minute, the idea of a virtuous circle where, you've heard of the phrase, she went from strength to strength. Well, there is a way in which, once you strengthen yourself a little bit, or, think of physical exercise. If you've been sedentary for a long time, it's really hard to get out of the chair, but if you get a little bit stronger, well, then it's a little bit easier for you to get a little bit stronger, and so it goes. So there's, it's a common sense notion. Good begets good, bad begets bad. Occasionally, good comes from bad, but we had better not presume too much on the mercy of God. Yes, sir.
Our peer, if you will, liberal democracy,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
population.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work. In the words of the cultural philosopher, Dr. Bill, how's that been working for them?
And you may have noticed that I described those two paths at the beginning of my talk, right? They have maintained pay and benefits for their workforce, but the workforce as a share of the population is shrinking. The last time I checked the OECD statistics, unemployment across those 28 nations was still at 10.5%, and among young people in Italy, Greece, Spain, and elsewhere, unemployment is in excess of 40%. So I am not recommending the European model, right? As a matter of fact, that's why I said at the beginning, we're on different decks, but we're all in the same boat. Because in the same way that our model is not succeeding, their model is not succeeding. I would still rather have ours than theirs, but that's not a race where winning first prize is a very satisfactory accomplishment, because we are falling short by our own standards, and that's really what matters. We're falling short by our own growth standards. We're falling short by our own inclusion standards. We're falling short by our own innovation standards. We're falling short by our own social mobility standards. So, I take no comfort from the fact that Europe does many things worse than we do. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about the shrinking of small business.
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeing this phenomenon. I don't have the research in my pocket like you would, but it seems to me that there are lots and lots of young people who are dismayed about going to work for a big company. They're not starting a small business. They're operating as independent contractors. And they're not even forming little companies because they're just connecting with each other. Whenever they need a skill that they don't have, they pull in somebody else. I know a lot of young people in their 30s, especially, that are doing this. Are you looking at that?
Well, yes, and and many other people are looking at it as well. And people have been writing books about this now for the past 10 or 20 years. It's still a relatively small percentage of the total economy and the overall workforce, despite all that we read about it. And it's also not an entirely successful model, unfortunately. And a lot of young people are just scraping along, and people in their late 20s and early to mid 30s are doing without retirement plans. Many of them, until very recently, did without health insurance, et cetera. So it's a high wire act with no net, and a lot of young people who begin with a wave of enthusiasm. You're your own business, right? You insource what you're good at and outsource what other people are better at, division of labor, share economy, cooperate, kumbaya. It's a lot harder to do that. It takes a lot of energy, and the economic rewards are not what people hoped for. You can do it when you're young, but by the time you get into your mid-30s, you've undertaken family responsibilities, et cetera. Can you really afford to be the boss of yourself to that extent? Some people can. If you happen to be in a neo-traditional marriage, maybe. But if you're supposed to contribute your fair share at home, it's very difficult. So, yes, and I don't want to gainsay that. And it is distinct, as you suggest, from the small business sector itself. But it has some real disadvantages in my view. There's a hand back there.
Yeah, is there any current government program you could say is a marked success towards leading us?
Well, I think you could say that cutting unemployment by more than half since the Great Recession is not a bad start. it compares, as I was saying earlier, very favorably to the very slow reduction in unemployment in most European countries. I can tell you when we last had full employment. It was at the end of the 1990s. If the economy is growing at 3.5% a year, then you're going to absorb all of the workforce and then some. So in many ways, the best route to full employment is accelerated economic growth. And I talked about some of the ways that we could think about getting that. But in addition, I mentioned a few more targeted ways. It'd be a lot easier for us to get to full employment if so many women didn't face so many obstacles to full participation in the labor force. And some very, very prosperous firms can afford to make it easier. But for others that are operating closer to the margin, even if they want to, it's extremely difficult. This is, for better or for worse, a responsibility that the public sector, AKA all of us, will have to shoulder. And the sooner we do it, in my judgment, the better off we'll all be. I think that paid leave for parents after the birth of a child is something that could be financed very, very inexpensively. It'd be somewhat more expensive to bring child care within reach of so many families that need it. But if we don't do that, then we're not going to get to full employment. And I guarantee you we won't, as long as businesses feel free to rearrange workers' schedules at their convenience. So you're expected to be on call 50 hours a week for 20 hours of work. How are you supposed to take care of children under those circumstances? Can't happen. So there's some very simple, concrete steps. And I don't think that it will cripple the American private sector to take these steps. It's possible to do them in ways that are not financed by businesses themselves, except to a small degree through their share of taxes, through corporate taxation, but it'll be financed by all of us. And in the case of paid leave, the best plans are financed by the workers themselves. They all pay into a paid leave insurance fund, which they can then collect on when they need it. And it's, compared to other payroll taxes, it's very inexpensive. So we just have to identify the problems and then find some steps that make sense across party lines that we might take. So if we don't believe, for example, we can fight for years about the minimum wage. Why don't we do what we agree on? If the Speaker of the House and the President of the United States, who don't exactly see eye to eye ideologically, can agree on a significant expansion of the earned income tax credit, why don't we just do it? Try doing what we agree on and spend only half our time fighting. I mean, that would be real progress. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I was just wondering, it seems like a number of the problems you were talking about, certainly not all of them, could be addressed by a stronger labor movement. Do you envision any role for organized labor in dealing with the redistribution of wealth and securing some of these benefits for workers?
I would welcome that. I don't expect it, right? Except in some sectors. The labor movement that many people look back to with nostalgia was really an artifact of the industrial economy for all sorts of reasons. And the American labor movement hasn't really figured out how to cope as effectively with the post-industrial economy. So the American labor movement now is most successful in the portion of our economy that most resembles the industrial economy, and that is government. So it's no accident that an overwhelming percentage now of the organized labor movement is the organization of public employees. There are some dynamic outfits like the SEIU that have done a pretty good job with service workers, particularly hotel workers. particularly in union-friendly states like Nevada, for example. But I think it's going to be very hard to restore that level of organization in today's economy, which is why I believe that if the balance between labor and capital is going to be improved, it has to be us collectively through government, and with as much help from non-governmental organizations as we can expect. But when you consider the fact that when I was in college, a third of the private sector workforce belonged to labor unions, and that figure now is down below 8%. Those are deep historical trends that I think it'll be difficult to reverse, which is why I'm not discounting it, and speaking personally, I'd welcome it, but I'm not expecting a restoration of the realities of 50 years ago. Yes, ma'am.
You brought to our attention the education system and the lack of training in practical affairs for students. Our education system moves, does it all, at all? Maybe not.
Slowly.
I mean, we're still looking at an agrarian society. The children are still going home at 3 o'clock to mothers that aren't there. How does that monolithic group get moved? Is it direction from business? This is what we want?
That's a terrific question, and it gives me an opportunity to get on one of my favorite hobby horses, and that is. Oh, I'm sorry, and that is, there are many things about the business community that baffle me. I spend a lot of time with members of the business community, and I can tell you that members of the business community, including some corporate executives of Fortune 500 companies whose names you would recognize, complain bitterly about the education system, but it's sort of like 20 questions. Okay, the schools produce students, and the titans of industry shake their heads and say, no, that's not what we're looking for. And so the schools try something else. And I am sure that if on the local level and state level, business consortia got together with the chief state school officers, with school superintendents, et cetera, say, look, we would love to employ the young people you're producing. Here's why we can't. Here's what we're looking for in addition to what you're doing. Can we work together to make it happen? That doesn't sound like rocket science to me. It is amazing how rarely that conversation takes place. And so we have this endless cycle. The schools produce students, and business says, no, we want them to be ready to contribute on day one. Footnote, because we don't do job training anymore in-house, right? We expect our people to be able, our employees to be able to, the quote is, hit the ground running. Well, speaking as someone who's cycled through a few jobs in his life, hitting the ground running is wonderful when it can happen, but it seems to me it's not to be expected. We could have a long discussion as to why the private sector has decreased by half in the past 20 years, the share of its cash flow that it's devoting to employee training. But, in the same way as the private sector is backing away from basic research, it's backing away from training. And we can either rant and rave, or we can say, okay, they don't want to do it, they have their reasons, so we can either accept a workforce that they don't want to hire, or we can try to figure out what it is that the education system could do working together with the private sector. That's my preference. That's another example of win-win. And I think that could work on a number of different levels. It could work very well if we're talking about 21st century skills training in high school, right? It seems to me that local businesses have a pretty good idea of what they're looking for, right? What they're short of. There are many parts of the country where skilled machine tool operators who are still necessary, skilled welders and people like that are almost impossible to find. And the median age of the workforces in those sectors is now in the mid-50s. 10 years, they're going to be retired. then what do we want? Then what are those businesses going to do? So it's in everybody's interest to get this conversation going.
What about Mark Zuckerberg and these people at the national level?
Yeah, yeah.
Getting involved with schools, and then they're getting criticized.
Look, we live in a culture of criticism, and trust me, I write a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal, and you haven't seen criticism until you've seen my letter. Now, I'm not exactly preaching to the, and I'm not exactly preaching to, look, a lot of people are trying, but I'm focusing on a particular sector of this. That is the conversation that ought to be taking place, not between educational experts in schools, but between the leaders of the private sector in schools. Right? They have an essential piece of the action to contribute. Yes, sir.
Do you have a plan B if the new normal for advanced economies is slow growth rates for any number of reasons, which you're well aware of, like all the big gains in productivity because of technology, or washing machine are behind us, and the recent stuff in innovation technology or
Yeah.
entertainment technology is the same thing, or could be because climate change requires
Mhm.
emissions and tech fixes necessary aren't going to be enough. Underinvestment might give rise to so-called secular stagnation. What do we do for the sake of stability, unity, and overcoming the rancor and alienation that we see if we're looking at low growth rates? And is there a sort of a revised version of inclusion or reduction of inequality or something that you think would be a second best or third best or something?
Well, yeah, but that's a very good question. I should confess that in this bag right here, I have a whole folder filled with competing theories of productivity and technology. And you're clearly knowledgeable about these theories. A famous economist by the name of Robert Gordon has just published a 700-page book, arguing that we've gone through between say the century from 1870 to 1970, we went through a very, very rare period of technological growth flowing through to productivity growth and economic growth, that it was an historical aberration. It is not to be expected. It was a one-time event. That's his theory, deeply contested among economists. So, and there, and some friends of mine sat down and rounded up half a dozen theories in 8 pages. I'd be happy to share that with you. My view is twofold. First of all, betting on the worst case is probably not a wise way to go when there's so much uncertainty as to whether that worst case is actually in the stars, our inevitable destiny, because it could be a classic example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But assuming that it is, if growth is going more slowly, if we're going to grow more slowly over the next generation or two than we did when things were going well, then all of us are going to have to accept the fact that there will be more role for government in sharing what growth there is. When growth is rapid, we can afford to let the market do a whole bunch of allocation, because in circumstances of rapid growth, when everybody is sucked into the labor force, when businesses are competing for scarce labor, it's pretty much guaranteed that what happened between 1995 and 2000 will happen again. Rapid growth, broadly shared. With slow growth, some people are going to be left out. Many people are going to be left behind. And we can either allow this pool of resentment and exclusion to grow and ultimately poison our society, or we're going to have to get into the habit of sharing more of what we produce with those who are not fortunate enough to have an opportunity to produce. And that's not an outcome I want. I prefer the America that I grew up in to an America with slower growth and larger government. But that's the logical outcome of your question, it seems to me. And having said that, I don't expect a cultural conversion of the American people to develop anytime soon. When growth slows and people are excluded, the aspirations don't go away. It's just that the gap between the reality and the aspiration widens, and then people get very angry, and that's where we are. And you know, I think it would be easier for us either to speed up growth or to share what growth we have more equally than to tell the American people to abandon their hope in progress. I do not believe that that the doctrine of the Club of Rome is our destiny. For those of you who are old enough to get that reference, yes, sir.
I was surprised that increased immigration was not on your list of tools to expand the labor supply. Why was it?
Because I ran out of time. That's why. If you'd like to see my notes, but as they say in Washington, I'm glad you asked, because in fact, that's the case. And the Congressional Budget Office a couple of years ago sat down and did a kind of an analytical balance sheet of what we could expect from a stepped-up pace of legal immigration. And the answer is all sorts of good things. Including the fact, here's a fact for you. A quarter of all American patents are owned by people who came to this country as immigrants. Quarter. They have been an enormous source of innovation in the past generation. And when I took my son to school, when was that? I guess 13, 14 years ago, college for the first time, it looked like the United Nations. It was amazing, right? And the vitality of those young students from everywhere, just took my breath away. And if you ask why have so many American cities renewed themselves over the past 10 or 20 years, the answer is immigration. I guess New York City is the poster child, but look at what's going on in a place like Queens. So the fact that we've now worked ourselves into a lather about immigration and have persuaded ourselves that it's part of the problem and not part of the solution, is a sign of a deep pathology. It's a classic case of displacement. I understand why industrial workers are unhappy, but immigration is not the right causal analysis. It is closer to the truth to say that the entrance of China into the world economy dealt a body blow to the U.S. manufacturing sector. A lot of research in the past couple of years. By the way, it's not NAFTA or any of the earlier trade agreements. The huge change in the U.S. manufacturing sector was the direct result of the entrance of China, and by extension, 2 billion workers from low-wage countries into the global market. Right? How could that happen without affecting everything else? It has affected everything else. So we should have a major discussion about trade and globalization, but beating up on immigrants is an analytical mistake and a political catastrophe, in my opinion. Do we have to end now? Because we will. But if people want to keep on asking questions.